His tongue was the first to go. Not with the brutal haste of a soldier's sword, but with the ceremonial patience of those who believed pain was holy. Split at the root, torn like a banner of defiance, it bled not just from its veins, but from its meaning. For in mocking the king's voice, he had not merely insulted a man, he had trespassed into something sacred, something ossified by divine right and drenched in centuries of ritualized terror. His laughter had cracked open the illusion of sovereignty, and that sound, the shrill echo of truth, was unforgivable. They pinned him like parchment against the scaffold, his back arching not from pride, but from the deliberate carving of flesh, layer by layer, inch by inch. The crowd watched in a reverent hush, as if witnessing the unraveling of a sacred text written in blood. It was not an execution, it was an exorcism, a purification of the air around the throne, a warning burnt into the eye sockets of all who dared breathe too freely. The skin peeled like old paint from an ancient chapel wall, flaking, falling, fluttering with grotesque grace. What remained was not a man, but a message. Sinew over bone, agony over arrogance, silence over satire. The king's voice had been mocked, and in response, the human body had been turned into a scroll of mutilation. This was not mercy. This was spectacle. This was not justice. This was ritual. This was not death. This was memory being written with a knife. And before we begin, we must remind you, we do not share this to horrify, but because we care for you deeply. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. The kingdom of Valancourt did not exist on maps adorned by scholars or emperors. It thrived instead on parchment steeped in fear, bound by silence, and guarded not by armies, but by tongues nailed to thresholds. Nestled between moss-covered woods and eternally clouded skies, Valancourt was a realm of echoes, where the king's voice was more than a sound. It was law, it was liturgy, it was the breath of the land itself, and like all sacred breath, it could not be mimicked, it could not be doubted, it could not, under any provocation or jest, be mocked. The king, Orwin the Sovereign as the hagiographies called him, was a man born not from lineage, but from famine and fear. The people whispered that he had been the child of a grave-digger's daughter, lifted to power during a rebellion's collapse. He had survived a dozen poisonings, one blinding and the ritual slaughter of his brothers in a rain-drenched cellar. His voice, hoarse, reedy, trembling with the aftermath of crushed lungs, was a relic of those years. When he spoke, the words seemed to crawl up his throat like smoke from a smothered fire. Yet no one dared imitate it. No one dared laugh. That is, until Aldrich. Aldrich was not noble. He was not learned. He was not anything that merited remembrance. And yet, his name would fester in history like a wound that never healed. Born to a glass-blower and raised among the forges of the lower districts, Aldrich had grown up listening, not just to stories, but to voices. He could imitate priests with solemn mockery, recite judges' verdicts with such eerie precision that the condemned would weep anew, and mimic the old king's rasp so perfectly that taverns would fall into drunken silence. He was not beloved. He was needed by the people who had forgotten how to feel anything but dread. The court jester, a man long reduced to spinning wheels and bloodletting humor, had died after mocking the wrong saint's holiday. And so the vacuum pulled Aldrich forward. Whispered invitations, shadowed carriages, a sudden summons not to be refused. He arrived at court wearing borrowed silk and wearing the same grin that would eventually be carved from his face. The king, seated beneath an ossified arch of jawbones taken from rebels, invited Aldrich to speak. And speak he did. With mimicry that was uncanny, no, unholy, he performed the king's first wartime speech, imitating each rasp, each guttural pause, each breath as if he were the sovereign reborn in flesh. For a moment, silence ruled the hall, then laughter. then horror. The nobles' joy died in their throats like birds falling mid-flight. Orwyn did not rise. He did not blink, but something shifted in the cold geometry of his eyes. The next morning, Aldrich's room was sealed shut, its walls soaked in goat's blood. Ritual cleansing, they said. He was taken not by guards, but by figures in robes whose faces were covered by masks shaped like owls. Silent, unblinking, symbols of royal judgment. The crowd was summoned, as they always were, by the tolling of the bell whose sound was said to mimic the king's voice in death. And so began a spectacle, not of law, but of liturgy. Valancourt was a land where law was not codified, but embodied. The king's voice was not merely a command. It was an inheritance of divine affliction. His mutilated lungs were seen as a sacrifice, a bridge between mortal and God. To mock it was to mock the origin of their suffering and their faith. The punishment, therefore, had to be neither swift nor quiet. It had to be remembered in muscle, in marrow, in the trembling silence that follows a scream. Beneath the judgment pillar, carved with the faces of blasphemers long dead, Aldrich was bound with ropes made of braided hair, taken, it was whispered, from those who had laughed before him. He was stripped not just of clothing, but of name. A priest of pain stood beside him, reciting a litany of sins that never named the crime directly, but circled it like vultures over a battlefield. No mention of imitation, only profanation of tone, theft of resonance, and parody against the divine larynx. This was not a trial. It was a theater. The spectators were not merely subjects. They were collaborators in the purification. Some brought their children. Others clutched icons etched with the king's crest, 3 lungs bleeding into a crown. In Valancourt, death was not personal. It was performance. Each act of torture was a reminder that the body belonged to the throne and the voice was merely a lease. Aldrich stood at the edge of that understanding, grinning still, though the corners of his mouth had begun to tremble. They say it rained that morning, not from the heavens, but from the eyes of statues lining the cloisters, their stone faces slick with condensation. But the people believed it was divine weeping. The king, however, did not appear. He listened, they said, from behind a wall made of saints' bones. His silence was not absence. It was orchestration. Thus the stage was set, not for execution, but for unraveling. For flaying not only a man, but the very idea that laughter could rise above the crown. There is no madness more complete than that which forms not in chaos, but in ceremony. Aldrich's undoing did not come from the lash of terror, nor from the pangs of sudden guilt, but from the slow suffocation of dignity beneath a system that fed on silence. The night before the skinning began, they placed him in the cell of echoes, an oubliette carved deep into the bowels of the palace, its walls smooth, curved, and shaped to repeat the sounds made within it. Here, his own voice became a tormentor. Every mutter returned, twisted, distorted, reverberated back like a demon in mimicry. He begged in whispers at first, then roared, then wept, and every sound that returned sounded like mockery of his own despair. He cried for water, and the echoes laughed. He recited prayers, and the prayers came back backwards. It was not solitude, it was spectral company, a mirror of madness. Sleep was forbidden, not by shackles, but by design. The flickering torchlight, never extinguished, cast shadows in shifting shapes across the walls. These shadows would morph, elongate, and bleed into one another until he could no longer tell if he was watching movement or hallucinating ghosts of former jesters, their mouths sewn shut with golden thread. When they fed him, they did not speak. A single masked figure would slide bread soaked in vinegar through a grate, always placed beside a decaying flower, wilting in mock reverence. This was not nourishment. It was instruction. By the 4th day, Aldrich had begun to whisper to the walls. He addressed them by name. Lark, Mercy, Silence, ghost. He apologized to the ceiling. He begged forgiveness from the floor. He believed, perhaps, that the building was alive, that it breathed in cadence with the king's lungs. And in Valencourt, perhaps it did. For the palace was not constructed of ordinary stone, but of petrified remains. Bones pulverized into ash and mixed into mortar. Every corridor was a reliquary, every threshold a tomb. Within it, madness was not an accident. It was architecture. He had been gifted once with a voice that could become anyone. But now, his own voice betrayed him. It cracked, it croaked, it hesitated like a traitor. No longer could he summon the king's rasp or the bailiff's drone. He could not even whisper his own name without hearing it mispronounced by the walls. He began to strike his head against them, not in despair, but in ritual, seeking to dislodge the mocking spirit within. Blood ran down his face like melted wax. He laughed, then shrieked, then collapsed. The trial had not yet begun, but already his body bore the bruises of conviction. When they came for him, hooded, silent, spectral, they did not bind his hands. They simply opened the door. He followed. Not out of obedience, but because he believed he was walking into a dream, a theater, a finale. He was marched barefoot through the procession of shame, a corridor lined with the preserved tongues of heretics nailed to beams of cedar. The smell of old rot and incense clung to the air like morning. Every few paces he stepped on salt, purposefully laid in a pattern meant to sear the souls. His skin tore. He did not flinch. Pain had become his native tongue. At the threshold of the courtyard, he stopped, not because of fear, but because of recognition. The stage where he had once performed for nobles now stood transformed. No more velvet drapes, no lutes, no laughter. Only a platform drenched in black oil surrounded by the king's sigil carved in concentric circles. A pit of ash smoked in its center, and iron tools glistened under gray skies. The instruments were not haphazard. They were curated, aligned like relics upon an altar. Hooks, flaying knives, bone saws, brands shaped like phonetic letters. Each one bore an engraving of the king's initials, not in letters, but in fractured ribs and collapsed lungs, the anatomical symbols of his suffering. At the edge of the crowd stood the priests of the voice, a sect sworn to guard the sanctity of the king's breath. Their robes were white, but their hands bled openly, as if to prove their humility. In place of sermons, they uttered guttural chants, composed only of the vowels that Orwyn could no longer pronounce. The sound was unbearable, an endless, nasal wailing like wind through a corpse's mouth. Aldrich was raised upon the scaffold and lashed to the pillar of correction, a vertical slab of limestone into which past offenders' names had been etched and then burned away. He would not receive a name here. He would become the wound. The ceremony began with the silence bell, a brass instrument rung by pressing a flayed palm against its side. It emitted no sound to the human ear, but all birds in the city took flight. This, they believed, was the moment the soul was released from the protection of anonymity. Aldrich, trembling, yet grinning through the tremors of psychosis, looked upward. He believed, perhaps rightly, that the cloud above formed a face. Whether it was Orwyn's or God's, no one could say. The executioner was not a man, but a woman known only as the Mimic. Her voice had been stolen as a child for imitating the king's stutter, and in return she had been given the highest honor, to strip imitators of their flesh. She wore no mask. Her mouth had been sealed shut with molten gold, forming a permanent grin. With hands like surgeons and eyes like apothecaries, she began her work, not in haste, but with adoration. She did not begin with his back. That would be expected. Instead, she peeled the soles of his feet. The crowd leaned forward, not in cruelty, but in communion. His screams, though muffled, began to resemble music. The priests transcribed each cry as scripture. children were told to memorize the rhythm of his agony, for it mirrored the king's first breath after the attempted drowning in his youth. Then came the fingers. The skin was removed in coils, carefully wound like parchment scrolls. His palms, known for their theatrical gestures, were peeled to expose trembling sinews, now stilled. Blood pooled, not in puddles, but in intricate channels etched into the platform floor. These grooves guided the fluid toward the center pit, where it sizzled in silence. By the time they reached his abdomen, Aldrich was no longer present in spirit. His eyes remained open, but what stared out was neither man nor beast. He had become something else, a vessel of memory, emptied of defiance. The final touch came when they removed the skin from his throat, not to kill, but to erase, to strip the very flesh that had dared form imitation. With ritualistic care, they branded his trachea with the royal sigil and placed his flayed throat into a crystal vial, suspended forever in the hall of hushed crimes. There was no announcement of death, no drum roll, no conclusion. The king's voice had been mocked, and now silence ruled once more. The mind, when subjected to relentless erosion, does not shatter all at once. It dissolves incrementally, layer by fragile layer, like paint blistering under the corrosive sun. Aldrich's descent was not abrupt madness, but a slow, cruel unraveling, orchestrated as much by his own inner shadows as by the men and women who flayed his flesh and spirit alike. In the days that followed the initial torment, his thoughts became a tangle of fractured echoes and splintered images, each one a remnant of his once keen wit, now corroded by isolation and pain. His body, raw and trembling, was carried back to the cell of echoes, where silence was a guise and the walls whispered secrets only he could hear. The voices were no longer mere mockeries of sound, but seemed infused with malice and sentience. They accused him of theft, stealing the sacred voice granted only to kings, and branded him a blasphemer unworthy of earthly mercy. The laughter that had once filled taverns at his mimicry now transformed into a cacophony of damned souls, each jeering at him with the voice of Orwyn himself, distorted and monstrous. In his fevered dreams, Aldrich found himself chained to the throne, his skin replaced by cold stone, his lips sealed with molten lead. The monarch's voice echoed through these nightmares, not with authority, but with a sinister, rasping hymn, a dirge for all who dared defy the sacred sound. He awoke drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, his lungs betraying him in cruel mimicry of the king's own ruined voice. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, and he could no longer discern whether the pain was inflicted by flesh or by phantoms. The court's cruelty was as psychological as it was physical. Guards and priests would enter his cell to whisper fragments of the king's speeches, twisting words until they became incantations of condemnation. They reminded him that his fate was not merely punishment, but purification, that his flesh was a vessel to cleanse the realm of impurity. They told him that the skin, once stripped, would become a relic, an eternal testament to the price of insolence. Days bled into nights, and nights back into days, with neither rest nor reprieve. Aldrich's mind, once sharp and mocking, began to fracture into fragments of guilt, shame, and delirium. He recalled his childhood, the warmth of his mother's hands shaping molten glass, the sharp clang of the forge's hammer, the distant laughter of children untouched by fear. Those memories flickered like dying embers, soon consumed by the cold shadows of his present torment. Yet even as his sanity waned, a perverse defiance took root deep within him. In moments of lucidity, he would whisper the king's voice, not as mimicry, but as mockery reborn. He would repeat the royal rasp with venomous affection, as though swallowing the poison of his captors to turn it against them. These acts of rebellion, though fleeting, stoked the fires of his unraveling. They were the last embers of a soul refusing total extinguishment. The priests, sensing this flicker of resistance, intensified their rituals. They chained him to the pillar of correction each day, forcing him to relive his impending doom in the glare of the crowd. The people's faces blurred in his vision, some twisted in revulsion, others in morbid fascination. Their eyes held no mercy, only a cold, ritualistic hunger for the spectacle of suffering. He felt himself becoming less human, more a symbol, a grotesque martyr carved from flesh and fear. Delusions grew around him like a suffocating fog. He imagined the king's voice as a serpent coiled within his chest, tightening with every breath, squeezing the last remnants of defiance into silence. His reflection in the cracked glass was a mask of agony and resignation, a face both known and alien. The man who had once mocked sovereign power now lay shattered beneath the weight of his own shadow. Yet paradoxically, Aldrich's psychological torment was not devoid of beauty. His suffering became a twisted poetry, each pang a verse in an elegy of flesh. The rhythm of his breathing, shallow and ragged, the slow pulsing of blood beneath torn skin, the cold kiss of death's approach, all wove together into a macabre symphony that transcended mere pain. It was as if the universe itself conspired to make his agony a dark masterpiece. The unraveling was not a linear descent, but a labyrinthine dance between lucidity and madness, pride and despair. Sometimes, in the silence of his cell, he would recall the first time he heard the king's voice, the rasped command that had summoned armies and crushed rebellions. It was a voice that bore the weight of 1,000 broken promises and whispered betrayals. To mock it had been an act of blasphemy, but also, in some twisted fashion, an act of love, a desperate attempt to reclaim power through laughter. But the kingdom of Valancourt would have none of it. Its gods demanded silence, and its king's voice was the eternal hymn. Aldrich's mind, once a weapon of satire, became a graveyard of broken thoughts. And as his body prepared to be flayed, his soul teetered on the edge of oblivion, neither fully lost nor fully present, a ghost in the theater of suffering. The dawn was a shroud, grey and leaden, hanging over the courtyard like a mournful veil. No birds sang, no breeze stirred. Even the stones seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the slow ritual of undoing to begin. Aldrich was carried once more to the pillar of correction, his body now a fragile relic. Skin pale, eyes sunken, hands trembling like leaves in the faintest wind. Each step was a descent into the abyss, a march away from the man he once was, and toward the hollow spectacle he was to become. He was stripped naked, not as an act of humiliation, but as a symbolic shedding of identity. His flesh, once a vessel for laughter and mockery, was now raw parchment awaiting the artist's blade. The priests of the voice gathered in a ring, their white robes stained already with the dark grease of ancient rites. Their chants rose and fell like a dirge, composed not in words, but in the agonized vows of the king's damaged breath, a sound that seemed to rip the air itself. The mimic, silent and grim, knelt before him. Her hands, steady and cold, touched Aldrich's skin as though greeting an old friend, a manuscript long unread and now unfolded for the final time. Her knife gleamed, catching the weak light and fracturing it into 1,000 sharp reflections, like shards of broken promises. The first incision was not a cut, but a caress, a long, deliberate slide of the blade just beneath the surface of the flesh. The skin parted reluctantly, a whispering sigh of betrayal. Aldrich did not scream. His mouth opened once, a soundless gasp that seemed swallowed by the heavy air. The crowd, gathered beyond the circle, leaned forward, faces fixed in rapt attention, eyes shimmering with reflected horror and fascination. This was no mere execution. It was a crucible of silence, a ritual of erasure. Layer by layer, the mimic peeled the skin from his back. The flesh beneath glistened, raw and quivering, a grotesque tapestry of muscle and sinew. The smell was sharp, iron and smoke, a scent that burned nostrils and dragged memories of slaughter through the mind. Blood welled like dark rivers, pooling at the base of the pillar and soaking into the ancient stone. The sound was faint, a wet tearing, a grotesque symphony of flesh and blade. Aldrich's breathing grew ragged. His eyes, once defiant, flickered with a haunted glaze. He seemed to float on the edge of consciousness, a spectral figure slipping slowly into shadow. The crowd's murmurs ebbed into a hush, as if the very air feared disturbing the sacred violence. Mothers pulled children close, their faces masks of horror and reluctant awe. The execution was no longer just punishment. It was a spectacle of sacred suffering, a theater of the body made holy by pain. The mimic's hands moved with clinical devotion, never hurried, never faltering. She flayed his arms next, spiraling the skin away in tight coils, revealing tendons that twitched involuntarily beneath exposed nerves. The cold metal of the tools contrasted with the warm pulse of blood, a dance of opposites, a balance between death and the fragile spark of life. Each coil of skin was carefully folded and laid aside, a parchment of agony written in flesh. At one point, the mimic paused and looked up, her empty smile fixed by molten gold to the king's box. Orwyn's eyes, cold and unreadable, bore down from behind a veil of bone and saints' relics. The ritual demanded not haste, but reverence, the slow unveiling of degradation as a form of brutal sanctity. The crowd shifted uneasily as the skin was peeled from Aldrich's chest, exposing ribs that quivered beneath the assault. The priest, chanting nearby, traced a finger along the pattern of exposed bone, intoning a dirge that spoke of betrayal and the sanctity of voice. To them, the exposed heart was a metaphor made flesh, the vulnerability of sovereign power laid bare. Aldrich's own heart thudded unevenly, a dying drum beneath the skinless canvas of his chest. The execution entered its cruelest phase as the mimic worked on his face, delicate and grotesque. She flayed his cheeks with precision, revealing the stark white of his jawbones, the hollows where his eyes flickered with pain and disorientation. The mouth, once a weapon of scorn and mimicry, was now a ruined cavern, stripped of flesh and meaning. The lips, peeled back, revealed teeth clenched in silent agony. The sensory horror was overwhelming. The smell of raw flesh, mixed with the incense of burning myrrh carried by priests, created a nauseating fog. The metallic taste of blood, both Aldrich's and his observers, hung heavy in the air. The sky, an unyielding gray, seemed to press down, suffocating the scene in a tangible weight. Time slowed to a crawl, seconds stretched into eternity as the ritual unfolded. When the skin was removed from his throat, the act carried a symbolic finality. The mimic traced the royal sigil, a broken lung encircled by shattered ribs, across the exposed windpipe with a branding iron, searing flesh and memory alike. This was not mere punishment. It was the erasure of voice, the violent excision of mockery from the sacred realm. The burning flesh hissed, and the acrid smoke rose in twisting spirals toward the leaden sky, a dark incense for the sacrament of suffering. As the ritual reached its end, Aldrich's body was no longer his own. It had become a canvas of horror, a grotesque scripture etched in blood and torn flesh. The mimic, with hands stained and steady, folded his flayed skin with the care of a scribe preserving sacred texts. The skin was sealed in a leaden box, destined to be locked away in the hall of hushed crimes, never to be seen, only whispered about. There was no final word, no last breath. The execution was a silence, a deliberate void where sound once lived. The crowd dispersed slowly, some sobbing, others stone-faced, all marked by the shared experience of witnessing a body undone. Mothers quieted their children with trembling hands, and priests murmured prayers for mercy that would never come. In the days that followed, the city of Valancourt bore the heavy weight of the ritual. The blood-stained stones of the courtyard were scrubbed, but the memory could not be cleansed. The echoes of Aldrich's screams seemed to linger in every corner, a ghostly refrain that haunted the nights. The king's voice remained sovereign, unchallenged, but beneath its hollow rasp lay the festering truth of human agony, the cost of silence enforced through fire and flesh. This was not justice, this was erasure, this was not punishment, this was theater. This was not the end, this was the beginning of a ghost. The court square, once a place of proclamations and parades, had now become a temple of dread. Flags that fluttered in celebration now sagged under the weight of fear. The cobblestones were swept clean, not out of respect, but to ensure the flow of blood would not be impeded. The king, it was declared, would no longer tolerate sound without sanction. And so, a new ritual was to be born. It began not with a trumpet's blast, but with the clanging of chains dragged across stone. The jester, what was left of him, was brought forth, no longer in motley attire, but in a robe of rough sackcloth. His mouth was sewn shut, not with silk, but with wire. Not to keep him quiet, but to let all see that his voice had been forcibly buried. The people had gathered in silence. Children were forbidden to speak. Mothers held their babies' mouths closed. Even the town's birds seemed to understand what this moment demanded. The wind moved through the crowd like a nervous prayer. Above it all, the king watched from his high balcony, draped in gold, surrounded by bishops and scribes. But it was not the king's eyes that haunted the people. It was his silence. For if the king said nothing, then none could know where mercy began or where it ended. The executioners moved without a word, their faces hidden behind veils of linen, as though to anonymize the instruments of punishment. One carried a curved blade, long, flat, and shining with a ceremonial polish. Another held a pail of warm vinegar and iron tongs. A third bore only a scroll, the royal edict of silence, written in crimson ink that had not come from a quill. As the jester was bound upright against the wooden pole in the center of the square, the crowd leaned forward, not to witness, but to comprehend. What crime could cause such theater? And then it was read aloud, not by a herald, but by the bishop himself. He who mocks the divine voice mocks the order of heaven. Let silence be gifted to him. Let flesh, the cradle of blasphemy, be peeled from him, so all may know the cost of insolence. Let him not die in haste, lest truth escape with his final breath. And then it began. The first incision was made along the spine, a gentle stroke at first, as if the blade merely kissed the skin, but the second stroke parted flesh. A sound escaped the jester's throat. Not a scream, not a cry, but a strangled gasp that echoed louder than thunder in a city so quiet. It was the sound of a man understanding his fate. They peeled his skin with reverence, as though removing the outer layer of a sacred manuscript. Each inch was placed delicately upon a golden cloth. The crowd did not flinch. Flinching was dangerous. To show disgust at the king's justice was to question it, and questioning was death. Halfway through the ceremony, the jester's eyes rolled skyward. But he was kept conscious, his pulse was monitored, his breaths were counted. He would not be permitted to faint, for to faint was to retreat into mercy, and mercy was forbidden. As blood pooled beneath him, the king finally stood. The crowd trembled. His voice, unused for hours, now filled the square. Behold the fate of those who believe their tongue might rise above the crown. Let this ceremony be performed once every season, as a reminder. From this day forward, the throne shall have its own silence, sacred, enforced, eternal. A boy in the front row turned to his mother and whispered, "Why did he laugh?" The mother slapped him silent. That slap, too, became part of the ritual. When it was done, when the final strips of skin had been removed and preserved in jars for the royal vault, the jester was allowed to die. His heart slowed like the tolling of a distant bell, echoing through the souls of every citizen present. They had seen death before, but not like this. Not crafted, not curated, not celebrated. The body, or what remained of it, was hung upside down from the city gates. His skinless form became the king's new flag, fluttering in warning with every gust of wind. It did not decay quickly. It remained for weeks, and in that time, the city learned a new language, fear without words. No one mocked again. No one whispered satire in taverns. No one even hummed unfamiliar tunes. The ceremony had worked. But silence, true silence, is not peace. It is a prison, wide as a kingdom and deep as memory. And in that silence, something darker was beginning to fester. Not rebellion, not yet, but resentment. Quiet, seething, blood-warm resentment. The kind that grows not in the open, but in locked rooms, behind closed lips, within the hearts of those who remember not the joke, but the punishment. The sun rose the next morning, not in glory, but in guilt. Its light touched every stone, every thatched roof, every trembling household in the kingdom. Yet none dared to call it a new day. The cries of the man who had been skinned alive still hung in the air like smoke after a church fire. And though his voice had long turned to gurgles and silence, the memory of what had been done could not be buried with him. His body, or what was left of it, had been strung out near the palace gates, no longer as a man, but as a statement. His fleshless form writhed no more, but it spoke volumes. At first, the people did not look. They shielded their eyes. Mothers rushed their children past. The markets remained closed. The usual bell that rang in the town square each morning stayed mute. The kingdom was quiet, but not in peace. It was the kind of silence one finds after a scream. Dense, sickening, unnatural. And then someone laughed. A low, bitter chuckle from a man at the well. His teeth yellowed, his fingers shaking, he dared mutter, "They fear a voice more than a sword. What kind of king is that?" He did not laugh long. Within the hour, he too was gone. His house raided, his family silenced, and by nightfall, his body hung beside the skinned one, though this time intact. They needed only one skinned ghost to haunt the kingdom. The rest would serve as echoes. In the palace, the king slept in a bed of gold threads and embroidered myths, but sleep had become his enemy. Each time he closed his eyes, he did not see the throne or the heavens. He saw the laughter. He saw the moment the jester's joke had landed and the courtiers had flinched. Not laughed, flinched. That sound, that absence of joy, it had festered in his skull like rot. He had ordered the man's punishment, not in rage, but in fear. It was not the insult that had hurt, it was the truth behind it. The jester had imitated his voice not as parody, but as prophecy. High-pitched, weak, unsure, a whisper masquerading as command. And when the courtiers hadn't laughed, the king had realized. Perhaps they heard it too. So now, every night, he lay there with his eyelids sealed in dread, his dreams echoing with phantom words. "You are not a lion, my king. You are a lamb wearing a lion's echo." He had heard it in the jester's mockery. He had read it in the eyes of his nobles, and he feared it in himself. The queen, for her part, had remained utterly still throughout the entire ordeal. She neither supported nor opposed the skinning. She was a woman of stone, not sentiment, and yet even she had started to feel it, the slow decay of reverence in the palace walls. The guards were more obedient now, but less alive. The maids whispered less, but blinked more nervously. Even the priest's sermons had begun to include veiled references to divine punishment, not just for the wicked, but for the prideful. And somewhere, in the attic of the palace, One of the young pages began sketching. He had seen the skinned man when they first hoisted him up, seen the way the eyes had remained open, like the soul hadn't fully escaped. The boy drew with feverish hands. He didn't know why, but something inside him whispered, "This must be remembered." And so he drew not the body, but the silence that followed it. He drew empty chairs, frightened faces, crows gathering on roofs, and a crown melting in the sun. In time, the kingdom tried to return to normal. The markets reopened, bread was sold again. The baker's daughter sang again, though softly now. Children played, but only in hushed voices, and each time someone dropped a plate or stubbed a toe or raised their voice, the eyes would dart to the palace. Would another punishment come? Was another man about to vanish? The king, meanwhile, had grown thinner, his meals untouched, his beard unruly, his mirror covered. He avoided speaking when possible. He signed edicts with a trembling hand, and in his silence a new power began to rise, not in rebellion, but in whispers. In the taverns and among shepherds, people began quoting the jester, "A man who fears a laugh should never wear a crown. The sharpest blade is a tongue unchained." They skinned him, but his voice stayed behind. What the king had tried to erase had instead been immortalized. The pain had made the message sacred. The cruelty had made the man a martyr. And though he had died without skin, his story wore armor now, armor made of fear, fire, and forbidden memory. A year later, the body was taken down, not from mercy, but because birds had eaten too much. Bones were scattered. The guards collected them with disgust, and when asked where they would be buried, the minister replied, "Somewhere no one will find them." But they were too late. The page's sketches had spread. The whispers had turned into folk songs. A new joke had surfaced among the children, mocking not the jester, but the king. He had taken the man's skin, but the man had taken his voice with him. In the end, silence did not protect the throne. It cursed it, and the man who had laughed had only spoken what the kingdom had already known. The final days of Mihaly Vurus were not lived. They were endured in echoes and murmurs that reverberated through damp corridors and crumbling stones. His skin was gone, but he had not died. Not yet. The physicians who visited his cell did not come to heal. They came to measure the endurance of a man turned into a living prophecy. How long could the body hold on after the soul had been carved out? He was swaddled in linen soaked with vinegar and salt, as per the custom of punishment that was never meant to end in death too soon. His screams no longer emerged as sound, but as a wet rattle from what was left of his throat. They had sewn his lips shut to keep him from biting off the remnants of his tongue. No one in the palace said his name anymore. They referred to him only as Azarnyek, the shadow, something once human, now reduced to a breathing emblem of treason. But shadows do not die easily. The irony, lost on most, was that the king, so determined to silence the man who mocked him, had inadvertently created a legend, not among nobles or chroniclers, but in the whispered lullabies of washerwomen and stable boys, among blacksmiths and poets who worked with hands cracked by fire. Mihaly had become a ghost even before his death, haunting the margins of society where no crown could reach. Some say his cell began to weep. Drops of water, too red to be rain, fell from the stone ceiling, collecting in patterns that resembled writing. The jailers, illiterate and superstitious, refused to enter. The air around his cell turned sour, not just with infection, but with grief. His breath came in rattled verses, as if each exhale recited lines from some forbidden poem. A priest was summoned to read psalms over the cell, but he fell to his knees, or trembling, whispering afterward that something was listening back. On the 7th night, lightning struck the tower under which Mihaly lay. The sky split with a scream of light, and the old stones groaned as if remembering some ancient injustice. The flames that followed danced across the roof like golden jesters, as if the gods themselves mocked the man who had tried to outlaw mockery. But Mihaly did not burn. The fire missed his cell entirely. When the guards entered the next morning, they found him lying still, skinless, motionless, but not gone. His eyes were open, glazed yet alert, staring not at the ceiling but into something no one else could see. A faint smile tugged at the stitched remains of his lips. And then he sang. It wasn't a melody one could repeat. It didn't rise in scales or fall into choruses. It sounded like wind through dead reeds, like a mother humming to a child that had already died in her arms. The sound seeped from his ruined lungs and bled into the walls. Men who heard it wept without knowing why. One guard cut off his ears. Another drowned himself in the moat. Even the rats abandoned the cell block, leaving Mihaly alone with his requiem. Word reached the king. He was not the same man anymore. His voice, ironically, had begun to tremble. Not from age or illness, but from the poison of public memory. He could not erase the whispers. He could not outshout the silence that had replaced laughter in his halls. People no longer sang his praises. They sang the song of the flayed. He summoned his advisors, his clergy, his torturers. All of them proposed solutions: burn the body, drown it, bury it under salt and iron. But every solution came with risk. What if destroying Mihaly now only deepened the myth? What if silence no longer served as protection, but as prophecy? In desperation, the king ordered a final verdict. Seal the cell. Bricks were laid. Mortar was poured. No prayers were spoken. They walled him in like ancient priests, sealing a plague away from the living. No one would see the shadow again. No one would know if he was dead or alive. The king decreed that all who spoke the name Mihaly Veros would have their tongues torn out. But it was too late. The name was no longer passed in speech. It was etched into thought, passed in inkless verses and the rhythm of breath. Children began drawing faceless men in the dirt. Women sewed figures into linens, marked by jagged red thread. Blackbirds perched on statues, cawing a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat echoing underground. And somewhere in the heart of the palace, the king began to stammer when he spoke, as if something had borrowed the strength from his tongue. The flayed man's silence had become louder than any trumpet, his suffering more eloquent than any sermon. And somewhere deep behind that wall of bricks, something still breathed. Perhaps not Mihaly, perhaps not even human, but something remembered. And remembrance, as the king would learn, was a rebellion more dangerous than speech. When the final stitch of his flesh was tossed aside and the blood-soaked scaffold abandoned to silence, the man who had mocked the king's voice was no more. His body, if it could still be called that, had been reduced to a study in pain, a relic of royal wrath, and a symbol of what words could cost in a world where power was not spoken but enforced through agony. Yet death, ironically, was not the end of his story. It was merely the beginning of his transformation. The king, who once thundered across his court with a voice likened to divine command, found that same voice now echoed with hesitation. The palace grew quieter, not out of reverence, but from fear. Musicians plucked their strings with trembling fingers. Jesters bit their tongues mid-joke. Poets wept in private. Even the echoes in the marble halls seemed cautious, as if the very walls remembered what had happened to the man who laughed. The execution had been meant as an erasure, but instead it became a prophecy. The man who was skinned alive was given no burial. His bones were tossed into a river where reeds whispered ancient sorrows. His skin, stretched and dried, was rumored to have been hung in the king's private chamber, a grotesque trophy of silence. But silence does not mean peace. Whispers began in corners. First among the washerwomen and gravediggers, then among scholars and stonemasons. Tale passed in hushed tones of a man who laughed and paid dearly, but whose courage bled into the soil. Where his body was discarded, flowers refused to grow. Birds never sang. Years later, when the king grew old and the gold of his throne no longer sparkled in the candlelight, he asked for music to soothe his dreams. None dared perform. When he begged for jesters to make him laugh, they bowed and trembled, but spoke no words. His court had become a cathedral of ghosts, mute, obedient, and utterly lifeless. One night, a boy too young to remember the punishment stood beneath the king's window and began to whistle a tune. It was off-key, rough, almost mocking. The king wept, not from rage, but from the unfamiliar ache of memory. For the first time in decades, he heard truth again. It was not beautiful, it was not polished, but it was alive. By morning, the boy was gone. Some say he was taken, others say he vanished. But in his place, carved into the wooden gates of the palace, were words no one dared to erase. He was skinned, but not silenced. And so, the man who had once mocked the king's voice lived on, not in flesh, but in every truth-teller who dared speak, every laugh that escaped despite fear, every voice that refused to bow. The king's reign would fade, his name swallowed by time. But the man without a name, the man without skin, he became legend. And legends do not die.